Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is being co-hosted by the engineers and scientists acting locally and the Ecological Society of America. And today's webinar is on protecting wetlands for healthy communities and ecosystems. My name is Erin Partland, and I'm a volunteer with ESAL. I'm joined today by Allison Mize and Nicole Zimmerman of ESA, with Kendra Zanzo of ESAL, and our panelists, Erica Harris and Royal Gardner. Throughout this entire webinar, feel free to utilize the chat functionality or the Q&A functionality to ask questions, submit them to our panelists or to any of our speakers today. We'll just kick this event off with introductions to ESAL and ESA. ESAL is an all-volunteer national organization dedicated to increasing local civic engagement by people with STEM backgrounds. We want STEM professionals to know not only that their skills are valuable to local projects, but how they can get involved. We are founded by engineers and scientists with experience in public policy, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. As a reminder, since we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, we do not take stances on policies or political positions, and this event is for educational purposes only. Our panelists are free to present their own views and do not necessarily reflect views of the organization. So we do have many resources available on our website, esal.us, so please check that out. We have a content team that works really hard on continuously publishing interviews and stories about STEM approaches to improving communities. We also have guides and resources for finding opportunities in your area to get involved in local engagement. And lastly, we have an events and workshop team that puts on several events every year to bring you informative discussions, interactive workshops, and even in-person events at national conferences. So if you are interested, we'd love to hear from you. And as mentioned, we are a all-volunteer organization. And so we have many openings, including those in writing, multimedia content, social media, web development, etc. You can even work with us to publish a blog post and keep an eye out for upcoming events. Since this is an ESA co-hosted event, I wanted to note here that our next workshop is for ESA members only, and that is on June 8th. So now I will hand it over to Allison and Nicole of ESA. You're muted, Allison.
Thank you, Erin. I'm Allison Mize, Director of Public Affairs with the Ecological Society of America, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Nicole Zimmerman, who is ESA's Public Affairs Manager. And for those of you not familiar with ESA, we're a scientific society that was founded 100 years ago, and we primarily exist for our journals. We publish 5 peer-reviewed journals and a membership bulletin. However, we do have members who increasingly over the years have wanted to get more involved in policy, and we try and present opportunities for them to do so. We've enjoyed working with ESAL, and we will be hosting a workshop during our annual meeting. But right now, whether you're a member of ESA or a scientist just interested in policy, you can find some resources on our website. You can subscribe to policy news. We maintain a budget, a federal budget, Federal Register and Legislative Tracker. If you're a member, we have a very active policy section, and then also a public engagements and communications section. And we have something called the ESA Rapid Response Team, which is composed of subject matter experts who can serve as media contacts for ESA, or also to help us form a policy position, serving as a subject matter expert. And then additionally, we have Graduate Student Policy Awards, where we train students to come into DC every year, receive policy training, and then go to the Hill. So we're very delighted to be working with ESAL specifically on this issue and presenting and having it presented today with our expert speakers. So thank you for attending.
Thank you, Allison. Kendra, over to you to moderate our panel.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kendra Zamzo. I'm on the steering committee for ESAL. I work in the Environmental Stewardship Department of Chickaloo Native Village in Alaska, Naktinianakaya. And I'm speaking today as an ESAL volunteer and moderating as that volunteer. And I'd like to introduce Erica Harris. She's the senior planner at the Puget Sound Regional Council, and she'll be one of our two panelists. Our other panelist is Royal Gardner, professor of law at Stetson University. And before we kick off the slides, I'd just like to let the panelists each know that they can ask questions of each other as we go through the slides. And I'd like to let the audience know that slides and other resources will be available after the event. And with that, so we have a question for each of the panelists to get kicked off here. And what is one way that each of you enjoys water features where you live?
Well, I could start. That's an easy one for me. I love paddleboarding. I live fairly close to Lake Washington, which covers the whole east side of Seattle. And that's where I'm coming from.
It's also an easy question for me as well. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, just off of Tampa Bay. So enjoy kayaking, but I also enjoy taking my law students out to the field and doing a swamp walk in Big Cypress National Preserve.
Great, thank you so much for that. Royal, you'll be giving your slides first, and in preparation for the slides, wetlands and stormwater management are really making waves in the news right now. So can you give us a short summary of the issues being heard by the Supreme Court in the case of Sackett versus EPA? And briefly describe the Waters of the United States ruling and its latest updates. And take it away, Royal.
Thanks. And again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is actually where I take my students. And so an interesting question is whether this Cypress Dome is a water of the United States or not. And the answer depends on which rule you apply. So why is this notion of waters of the United States, or WOTUS, so important? Well, it's the waters that are protected by the Clean Water Act. If something is a WOTUS, you need to get a permit before you discharge pollutants into it. If it's not a WOTUS, you're not going to need a federal permit. So it's a statutory term, but a lot of the action takes place in the agencies, in the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So Congress just gave us this phrase. What does it mean? The agencies have defined what WOTUS means through a series of rulemakings. After each rulemaking, there happens to be litigation that follows in terms of whether the agencies have followed the proper procedure or have correctly interpreted Congress's intent. So we've gone through a series of rulemakings over the years. One of the most significant cases that came out was the Rapanos case, which in the Supreme Court, there was no majority opinion. There was Justice Scalia wrote for 4 justices, had a very narrow view of what waters should be protected. There were 4 other justices in dissent that had a broader view. And in the middle, there was Justice Kennedy, who proposed a significant nexus approach. That is, that waters that have a significant nexus to a traditional navigable water should be covered. And so pre-2015, the agencies issued guidance based on Rapanos. And so it was operating under regulations issued in the 80s and this guidance. The Obama administration attempted a rulemaking in 2015. Ultimately, that was enjoined by the courts. The Trump administration came in, formally repealed the Obama rule, tried its own rule, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but that was also tossed by the courts, which brought us back to the pre-2015 regime. If you're still with me, the Biden administration then came out with its own revised definition of WOTUS in 2023, which again has been challenged in the courts and at this point is only in force in 24 states. In 26 other states, it's the pre-2015 regime. I actually don't think there's a significant difference between the pre-2015 regime and the Biden rule, the 2023 rule, but we can talk about that a little bit later. Because currently, before the Supreme Court is a case that deals with definition of WOTUS, and specifically what wetlands are protected under the Clean Water Act. And so this involves a parcel of property in Idaho, about 300 feet from Priest Lake, which is a traditionally navigable water. There's a shallow subsurface connection, and the question is whether that's sufficient to assert jurisdiction over this area under the Clean Water Act. The lower courts applied the pre-2015 regime, the significant nexus approach, and said, yes, this is a jurisdictional wetland. The Supreme Court then took the case to say, is this the correct standard or rule to apply? The Sacketts are pushing the Scalia plurality opinion that was in the case of Rapanos, and they're taking a very aggressive stand. In their brief, they said a wetland is not a water. So this is that Cypress Dome I was in, where I bring my students, that under the Sackett approach would not be a water and thus would not be WOTUS. In support of the Sacketts, there are a number of entities and organizations and states that have filed what's called friend of the court briefs or amici briefs or amicus briefs, where they give their position on the matter. And so many industries, mining, farmers, home builders, and a lot of states are supporting the Sacketts. Supporting the federal government, supporting the U.S. EPA are some environmental groups, but also 12 scientific societies. So actually, I was attorney on that amici brief, which includes the Ecological Society of America, and in that brief, we tried to educate the court about the importance of wetlands and the importance of science being taken into account, and also what the impact would be of a restrictive ruling. If there is a requirement, for example, that there be a continuous surface connection between a wetland and a traditional navigable water, that would eliminate 20 to 50% of coverage of wetlands, depending on the watershed. There's also another part of the test that the Sacketts would like to have applied, which would result in almost the complete elimination of federal protection of wetlands under the Clean Water Act. So the stakes are very high in this case. The oral arguments were held in October. It was the first case the court argued, and we're still waiting for an opinion at this point. We were not optimistic when we went in. We're slightly more optimistic after oral arguments. It's really uncertain, but Justice Kavanaugh, for example, seemed to indicate that he thought that within 300 feet was close enough to be considered adjacent. But as I said, we're still waiting for an opinion, and we're not sure how the court is going to rule. Different ways they might rule is they might decide, we'll just dismiss this case. We shouldn't have taken it in the first place and allow the litigation over the Biden rule to play out. That's probably not likely at this point. It is a possibility. What's more likely is they'll focus their decision solely on wetlands, but it could be broader. They could also give some guidance on what types of streams would also be protected or not protected. What are the likely impacts if the Supreme Court concludes that the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act should be restricted, should be reduced? Well, the first thing is, if you're dealing with a non-jurisdictional water, you don't need a Clean Water Act permit. Even if this project was the subject of a previous permit denial. Instead, any permit requirements get kicked to the states. Now, so the impact of the environmental impact here will depend on what the states are doing in terms of protecting these waters. But there are some states that are not particularly protective, and indeed their own laws say they have to constrict jurisdiction when the feds constrict jurisdiction. So we'll have to see. There are also some other effects on other laws, and we can get into the details of this during the discussion period. But if there's no Clean Water Act permit, then there's no need for a Section 401 water quality certification. There are implications for the Endangered Species Act as well. And if you're in the restoration business, if there's no need for a permit, there's no need for compensatory mitigation, and thus no need to buy mitigation bank credits, for example. So we are waiting for the court to rule. The court should rule sometime before the end of June. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Royal. That was really informative and a nice summary of the situation. So Erica is with Puget Sound Regional Council, and so she is looking at what this means on the ground. Local implementation is critical. It requires the coordination and collaboration of a number of groups in differing expertise. So Erica, can you tell us about a successful conservation project or some projects at Puget Sound Regional Council and what it took to get there, to get those outcomes?
Sure, and I'm sharing my screen. I want to make sure that I have the right mode. Are you seeing the presenter mode or the full screen?
It just went to full screen.
Okay, great. Before I answer the question, I wanted to give a little bit of context in case you're not familiar with metropolitan planning organizations. The Puget Sound Regional Council is the MPO for the 4 counties around central Puget Sound. We have 82 cities and towns, and it's really where the region comes together to make decisions. And it's a little easier for our elected officials to agree to protect the environment when they know that all of the communities around them are going to do the same. And it's especially important that we come together because we know we're going to have more growth up through 2050. We're going to grow significantly, and we want to make sure we do that in a sustainable way. So I would say really one of the most important parts of our coordination is land use planning. If we can make sure that we don't impact those wetlands that are out in the rural and resource lands, and we grow more closely in centers and transit station areas, that's the best way to protect the wetlands that haven't been impacted yet. So we have a regional growth strategy, and that's where we want to put most of our growth. So I would say, we're working together on making sure that we grow where we want to is important. And then as far as wetlands in our urban growth areas, we have some fairly strict rules around critical areas, and wetlands are one type of critical areas. So I wanted to tell you about a project level conservation project. This is for protecting water quality. So we are really excited about stormwater parks. They're often constructed wetlands. So, there are definitely some areas where we didn't protect wetlands as well as we should have in urban areas. And so we want to protect water quality by putting together these multi-benefit projects. And stormwater parks are regional stormwater retrofit facilities, so they can retrofit like an entire neighborhood or basin with water quality management. That also have some kind of recreational component. It could be trails or a traditional play area, even a community garden. And besides taking care of stormwater and improving water quality and providing recreation, it can also improve equity when they're built in places that don't already have access to parks and open space. So because this is an important strategy for Puget Sound recovery, we received a national estuary program to promote stormwater parks. And I just want to give you a couple of examples. The photo you see in the background is the Arlington Stormwater Wetland Park. It manages 280 acres from Old Town Arlington. That's their downtown that didn't have any stormwater management because it was built quite a while ago. And it provides trails, a dog park, and access to the Stillaguamish River, which you see there. So people really enjoy this park. It's also working hard to protect water quality for the salmon that go through the Stillaguamish River. And then this is a kind of a smaller scale stormwater park in Shoreline. That's just north of Seattle. And when they did a park renovation for Cromwell Park, they built this stormwater park in, and it covers 109 acres in the surrounding neighborhood. So it's managing quite a bit of stormwater, and then it has trails around it. The neighbors really like it for the wildlife viewing that's been improved since they added the constructed wetland. So that's another example of a stormwater park. And then this one is actually Manchester Stormwater Park across the water in Kitsap County. And this is actually more of a kind of mix of gray and green. So it's not a constructed wetland, but I just want to give you yet another example. So, and these are important, an important example of how different disciplines work together. These require people from the Parks Department, from stormwater, from land use, all working together. So I think this kind of interdisciplinary approach is going to be more and more important to these types of projects and also conservation projects. So I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those great examples and bringing it back from the federal level down to what it means on the ground. So first I'd like to ask each of you if you have questions of each other.
Erica, what type of public participation is involved in the planning for these stormwater parks?
Oh, that's a great question, because it's really important, because they're facilities for the community. So you really want to build them, and you want to build what the community wants. So that last example that I showed you is had a lot of community involvement, and they wanted, for example, a place for their flea market. So that's why it ended up being kind of a flat, grassy sort of plaza area rather than a constructed wetland, because they really needed a place for the community to come together and do fun things. It's also where they put up a holiday tree in December. So it's actually a really great community resource. But all of these stormwater parks should really have lots of community involvement. So we are in our project that we just did with stormwater parks, we actually did a guidance document, and that's an important part of the process, is doing that, and also thinking about equity, how you reach out to diverse neighbors. So I did forget to mention, we do have a Stormwater Parks webpage if anyone wants to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And Royal, I have to say, I really want to know what the outcome of this is. So I know you can't answer that. So I'll leave it at that and see if I can think of a better question for you.
Yeah, we're just waiting. I mean, at this point, the court has issued very few opinions, which is unusual. It's probably the biggest backlog they've ever had. And it may be partly due, the speculation is due to last term's leak of a draft Supreme Court opinion in the Dobbs case, and that they're being a little bit more careful about how they circulate draft opinions. But we should find out in a couple of months. And one of the pieces that the court may take a look at is whether the significant nexus test is the right test to use in determining whether a wetland is jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act, and that can have implications for the Biden rule.
Thank you both for that. A question for both of you. As Erica was talking about, conserving wetlands provides value for humans and the environment both, especially when communities are involved in that planning process. Can you talk a little bit about how wetlands protection today is supported from cost and benefit perspective, and how that value is generated, particularly where there's disproportionately affected communities that haven't been listened to as much in the past? And that's a question for both of you.
Well, I'll jump in first, sort of at a broad level. When the agencies, the federal agencies, are crafting their regulations, including defining what constitutes a water of the United States, there is a cost-benefit analysis that should be done. In addition, when an agency is issuing a permit, when the Corps of Engineers, for example, is deciding whether to issue a permit or under what conditions it should issue a permit, it also will be taking into account costs and benefits. What's the value of this particular water body to the community? What functions and ecosystem services does it provide? So those are a couple of different areas where costs and benefits are taken into account.
Yeah, I don't know as much about that cost and benefit analysis, but I would say we know that wetlands have huge benefits, and that is not necessarily seen by the private sector. So that's when the government steps in to regulate, because we know that there are costs in both short term and long term, and the public will end up paying if someone else doesn't. So I think, you know, that's part of the function of government regulation, is to take into account those costs and benefits. In Washington State, I mentioned we have our critical areas ordinances, that's required by the Growth Management Act. So we have some fairly strict rules about local governments designating and adopting regulations to protect wetlands and other critical areas.
I guess I'm excited. I'm kind of interested from Erica's perspective. Do you see communities getting excited about the benefits of these, or does it take a little while to drag them along and convince them that wetlands are something that we really need?
Well, I showed you the example of the Cromwell Stormwater Park. And so like I said, that's a constructed wetland, but the community was a little hesitant. They weren't sure if they really wanted a wetland, you know, in that park. And then afterwards, after it was built, they saw the birds that were coming, and they loved walking around and through. And so they became, you know, what I've heard is that they ended up just loving that wetland for all of its benefits. So I think there are a lot of fans out there if they have a chance to actually experience them. So we do need them in urban areas.
Yeah, I agree. I just, it does seem like sometimes it takes a little convincing, and it's great to see the examples, because then you can share that with more communities. So we're about to open it up to the audience questions. And before we do that, can you tell us some ways that people can begin to get involved if they are interested in protecting wetlands and these issues that we're talking about?
You want to go first, Erica, or you want me to?
Oh, you can go ahead, Darrell.
Oh, okay. So you can get involved at a few different levels. So again, sort of going back to WOTUS and the agencies at the federal level, when they are crafting their regulations, they have to do a public notice and comment process where they publish the proposed rule in the Federal Register and solicit public comments. And so there's an opportunity for you to get involved there, to submit your comments to the agency, either individually or through an organization. It's also, there's also an avenue for you to participate in individual permit decisions, so that when a public notice for a particular project is issued or published, you have the opportunity to provide the agencies your views on what the impacts or the benefits of that project might be. More broadly, I would just say fostering general education about wetlands. That's one of the reasons I try to take my students out to the field, because it's one thing to read about it in a book. It's another to actually wade into the swamp and recognize just how beautiful it is, and how really invigorating it is to come back out and not be attacked by an alligator. So that's fun. But more seriously, get involved in the political process. I mean, simply by voting. But also, I really encourage you to run for office, because that's ultimately how you can affect change. And I'm really delighted and proud that my state house representative here in Florida is Lindsay Cross, who's an environmental scientist. So I'm sure, I haven't talked to her about this, but I'm sure she'd love to chat with any of you who might be thinking about running for office. Thanks.
Yeah, that was a great list, Royal. I'm glad you went first. So I get to just add on top of that. There are a lot of advocacy organizations like National Audubon and the local chapters that you could get involved with and support them. I also learned just recently about duck stamps. So apparently that they help fund conservation as well. So you could just do your research on duck stamps, and then there's also sometimes opportunities to do wetland monitoring, so you get involved locally. And I know that a lot of schools have wetlands, or if they don't, you could encourage them and help them build a wetland as part of their school, and even help volunteer, educate the children. So think there are a lot of really a lot of good opportunities.
So, Erica, related to the answer you just gave, this is a question from the audience. Do you have monitoring protocols of the benefits of stormwater parks? Is that something people could just look up online somewhere?
We don't have any monitoring protocols. I think that's a great idea. We do have, because these are regional stormwater facilities, there's a lot of kind of very specific regulation around those. And so, and there's a group, at least in Washington, then they look at monitoring, and they kind of, cities pull their resources together to figure out, like, okay, if we monitor this type of stormwater park looks this way, if we monitor it, can we apply what we learn from that to a similar type of stormwater park? So I think there's some learning in that way. And yeah, I think we could probably do more with monitoring.
And here's an audience question for Royal. How will the WOTUS decision impact the previous decision or actions in the Maui decision about groundwater linkage and the contamination of coral reefs?
That's a good question. So the Maui case came out a couple of years ago, and that dealt with a slightly different issue, whereby there was discharges to groundwater that were migrating to the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Hawaii. So there was no doubt that the water, the Pacific Ocean, was a navigable water and covered by the Clean Water Act. There, however, the legal question had to be whether that indirect discharge required a Section 402 permit. And the court, in a 6-3 decision, somewhat surprisingly, concluded that indeed a permit was required, that a permit is required for either a direct discharge to a navigable water, or water of the United States, or the functional equivalent of a direct discharge. So that was a very positive science-based decision that the court issued. And so, hopefully they will follow that line of reasoning, taking science into account in the decision about what constitutes a water of the United States. Also in Maui, the court very much took into account the overall objective of the Clean Water Act, to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And so hopefully that will be a big part of their decision in Sackett as well.
Great, thank you very much. Here's a question from the audience for Erica. What are the funding streams for stormwater parks, and is that likely to be impacted by the WOTUS decision?
I don't think that decision would impact the funding necessarily. I do know that in our state, we have quite a few resources available for regional facilities. Again, those are facilities that manage stormwater on a basin basis rather than just a site-by-site management. And so the Department of Ecology has a lot of different grants for that. Also, I think local funds certainly are going to be an important part of funding a stormwater park, especially since it does have that park feature as well. So the our Department of Commerce also has kind of some infrastructure funding. So there are quite a few sources, and that's more of a local answer. So nationally, I'm not quite sure who all would fund it.
And here's a question for Royal. One of the groups that provided an amicus brief in support of the EPA was the Menominee tribe. Can you discuss the specific impacts to tribes that are different than the impacts to the general population in this decision between SACIT and EPA?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So all of the briefs that have been filed by the parties and the interested stakeholders, the amicis, who wish to educate the court are posted online. So you can either go to the court's website, or if you go to SCOTUS blog and just Google SCOTUS blog and SACIT, and that will pull up a page that summarizes the issues and then provides all the briefs as well, including this brief on behalf of the tribes that was submitted by Earth Justice. And one of the points that Earth Justice was trying to make was that there needs to be the federal government needs to have a role in protecting water quality, partly because of the transboundary impacts that tribes can be affected by pollution coming from upstream, and that if there's not federal involvement, then the water quality in these in the tribal territory will suffer.
And I'd like to jump in and give just a little bit more information on that, because I do work for a tribe. Sometimes the wetland fill permit is the only federal permit in a project. And a lot of people don't know that tribes have a government to government relationship with the federal government, but frequently not with a state government. And so there is some concern that tribes could lose an opportunity to have real input on some permitting projects if that's the only nexus with a project.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And if it is the only federal nexus, that has implications for a host of other sections of the Clean Water Act and other laws. So states or tribes would no longer be requested to issue a water quality certification under Section 401. It's not needed if a permit is not applicable. NEPA would not apply if there wasn't a federal action. There's sort of a weird result with the Endangered Species Act. So if there's no need for a Section 404 permit, then there'd be no requirement for Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act. But if there were endangered species on the project site, the Endangered Species Act still applies. It just then kicks the permittee or the developer over to the Section 10 incidental take permit provisions, which don't have as tight timeframes as the consultation does. So it's actually not as advantageous from a developer's standpoint. But the main point is that there are these knock-on or cascading effects if federal jurisdiction is removed.
Great, thanks. And since we do have an audience of scientists here, we have a question from the audience. Where do you most see a need for scientific expertise in your respective areas? As a PhD scientist, I would love to move beyond research and into more active policy work. It's a little bit similar to a question we had before, but maybe hone right in a little bit more rather than the public. As a scientist, what particular aspects are really important for a scientist to bring to these?
I'll just throw out that we have a lot of questions here in Washington about wetland buffers. You know, we want to protect them as well, even though those are considered indirect impacts to wetlands. So, and you know, what kind of mitigation do you need if you are going to impact those buffers? So I think a lot of city, you know, scientists that work for the city, the natural resource specialists are going to be called in to you know, weigh in on that work, as well as the folks that work at, you know, at the state level and other agencies to help us figure this out.
I think, I mean, there's a number of potential avenues from you know, one way would be to reach out, well, to work for a government agency and to try to ensure that science is taken into account in the policy decisions. But then also holding your political representatives accountable, or at least getting in touch with them and trying to ensure that they are informed about the consequences of their actions or inactions. And then again, I come back to, I really urge folks to consider running for political office. You know, we might look at the people who are running and we say, oh, you know, we may not be impressed with them, but they're running. It's really, really hard. I mean, it is it takes a personal toll and commitment. But you may disagree with them very, very strongly on their positions, but they are at least running. And so I think you have to respect that. And so I really encourage folks to think about that at some point in your career.
Yeah, maybe one other area, I'm sorry if I missed this, but maybe one other area is looking for advisory boards where you might be able to provide your science to some of these situations, whether it's a Parks and Rec board or a wildlife commission or whatever it might be, or planning commission, might be opportunities there as well. Erica, we have another question that came in from the audience. Do wetlands still have a benefit when in urban environments where there tend to be recreational access and where wildlife are impacted?
Yeah, so the examples I showed you, there were areas where they didn't have a wetland. Like the existing condition was no wetland. So definitely those constructed wetlands had a benefit. If they were, you know, a natural wetland, and that would have you know, a lot more ecosystem services provided. But that constructed wetland also does a great job with water quality, especially if you have the soils and plants. And then, you know, the wildlife seems to enjoy that as well. There are, you know, plenty of places left in urban areas where they have not impacted the wetlands that are there. And so it's going to be, you know, really important to not impact those. I mentioned buffers. Those are usually kind of the areas where there might be the most, you know, there could be some impact, and then some compensatory mitigation needs to happen in that case if you can't avoid those impacts. But you know, we're not We're also seeing a few areas where people are rebuilding where they knew there was a wetland and they had filled it in the past. Wasn't working so well as one example is a ball field that was near my house, and they realized that this ball field is just going to be soggy. So I guess we should just create a wetland again, and it's where there was an original wetland, and it's a beautiful place. I don't think it probably functions as well as the original wetland, but it certainly became one quite quickly once they regraded it and put in the plants. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there are definitely a lot of benefits to recreating as well.
Great, thanks. Here's one for Royal. The WOTUS decision, or the second EPA decision and the impact on the waters of the U.S. ruling directly impacts wetlands. How could that indirectly affect fish and migratory bird agreements or federal regulations around those?
So, I mean, it could affect the species, because if the wetland is no longer protected, then they're at greater risk of being filled. To the extent that there should be some consultation either under the Endangered Species Act or the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, that would fall by the wayside as well if a wetland was not jurisdictional. So I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is just how many different ecosystem services wetlands provide. That they not only protect us from floods, storm surges, and help with water quality, but they also, as the question suggests, also provide important habitat for many different species, including migratory birds. So a decision that restricts the scope of the Clean Water Act will have an impact on habitat for migratory water birds, for example.
Related to that, I'm thinking of the pictures you showed of that one wetland that's where everybody's kind of thigh deep in water. That's certainly one kind of wetland, but there's also wetlands that can be relatively dry, or maybe dry for long periods of time and intermittently wet. So I'm wondering, with this discussion of this significant nexus, can you anticipate how, or discuss maybe how science would look at the hydrologic connections, and maybe there could be a ruling on which ones provide a certain degree of water quality and hydrology linkage, and how that works with that significant nexus ruling. Maybe the Supreme Court would say, if there's a certain percent of flow supported to a stream, then even if it's underground, it would be under the Clean Water Act protection because it affects hydrology. But if it has less of an impact, or it's more intermittent, it might come outside of the CWA. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, whether the Supreme Court could come not where it throws all wetlands out or keeps all wetlands in, but based on the contributions and how wet and dry they are.
Right. So the court may try to strike a middle ground, and often what the court is trying to grapple with is some limiting principle, or where can they draw reasonable lines, or whether it may not be the court's role to do that, rather that the court defers to the agency's expertise in this area. But there are a number of different ways that the court might go on this, and it's really hard to say, what they might do, right? They might say, oh, in order to be jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act, there needs to be a continuous surface connection. That would be one line they might draw. But then, of course, that ignores the science of the subsurface connections and the important role that wetlands play in maintaining the water quality or contributing to the water quality of downstream waters, even through a subsurface connection. And that was a point the court did consider in the Maui case. So perhaps they'll consider it here. Really hard to say though where they're going to draw the line. The one thing that I really hope they do not do, and this is one of the points we made in our brief, is that the Sacketts were arguing basically a two-part test, that there needed to be a continuous surface connection such that, and this is the second part, such that it was difficult to tell where the wetland ended and the other water began. And not a lot of briefs focused on that, but if the court adopted that, that's what wipes out federal jurisdiction over wetlands for the most part, because we can delineate, right? That's the whole point of wetland delineation. They decide it largely based on the plants, right? In terms of where the wetland ends and the other water begins. So that was actually a question that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson seemed to pick up on. So hopefully that will at least be discussed in a thoughtful manner among the justices. But at this point, I don't know.
From a science perspective, that is so crucial, right?
Yeah.
Those connections. Yeah. Erica, kind of related to that a little bit, if the Supreme Court does decide in favor of Sackett, especially if they go to this extreme position, what would the state of Washington need to do to continue to support your work through your regional council?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to it, but it does seem like, given the climate and how it's changing, wetlands are a really important resilience strategy. We need these sponges so our communities don't flood, and of course to provide water when it's drier. They do so much for us. So I think our state will be working pretty hard to make sure that they're protected. Sorry, I don't have more of an answer than that.
No, that's great. I think states are really going to struggle if it's all on them. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I guess for both of you, related to these questions, is what current trends in development do you see as the biggest threats to protecting and preserving wetlands? And Royal, maybe you could go first.
Well, so historically it was agriculture that was the main driver of wetland losses. But after Swamp Buster and programs like the Wetlands Reserve Program, that's flipped to where we now see sort of development is basic development is what is resulting in wetland loss. Wetland degradation can come from a host of activities, including agricultural runoff and runoff from lawns as well as just sort of the traditional trash and plastic. But in terms of actually eliminating wetlands from the landscape at this point, one of the primary drivers would be development, non-agricultural.
And
Yeah,
Eric,
I'd have to agree with that.
So on a more hopeful side, in general, green infrastructure deployment has been really successful. We've actually seen some of that up here where I live, as well as some of the examples that you've given. So the next generation of green infrastructure, such as stormwater parks, could be even bigger and more effective. Do you see a future where green infrastructure is by default, or infrastructure is by default green infrastructure and designed to be ecologically protective, just as a default of how you design your roads and other infrastructure?
Yeah, I think we'll move in that direction. I think there'll always be a mix of green and gray, especially in areas where you don't have a lot of space. Sometimes you need those engineered solutions to make it work. But I think there'll always, more and more, there will be more of the green brought in, even if it's a kind of a gray engineered solution. It's a great way for engineers and scientists to work together, though, to figure that out. You know, we're seeing a lot of you know, very cool planter boxes underneath like a high rise, and of course green walls and green roofs, and yeah, and we need to really think of street trees as important infrastructure because of, you know, the urban heat island effect, and we need that, you know, those communities where we want to see more growth happen. They need their trees, they need their parks and open space for people to want to live there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that optimistic note, and also note that the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act contains $370 billion over 10 years for nature-based solutions for clean energy and green infrastructure projects. So hopefully that source of funding will incentivize those actions.
Great. I appreciate all your input and feedback. Before we end, you both talked about some of the functions of wetlands and how they can benefit birds, wildlife, trails, flea markets, farmers markets, everything that people, different things that people and wildlife might need. Is there anything else you would like to talk about that we need to be understanding about how wetlands function to benefit ecology or humans, or both together? Is there anything you'd like to highlight about those functions and how we're missing it, how we're not communicating that or understanding it?
I'll add to that list that they're great carbon sinks if they are intact and healthy wetlands. So we need to think of them as a climate change strategy.
Yeah, I mean, wetlands historically have had bad PR, swamps in particular. That's why I like taking my students out to that Cypress Dome, which is it's rain fed. The water is very clear, and if you go out there at the right time of year during the right time of day, you don't get eaten by mosquitoes. And so it's a very it's a cathedral-like experience to be inside there, and that helps. There is a cultural and spiritual aspect of wetlands as well that folks can take into account. And sort of one sort of final, if I could, one final thought to try to sort of move from like the local all the way to the international would be that there is an international treaty dealing with wetland conservation called the Ramsar Convention. And the U.S. is one of the 172 countries that have joined this treaty. And part of the commitment when a country joins a treaty is to designate wetlands as wetlands of international importance, known as Ramsar sites. We have 42 in the United States, and it's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that makes this decision on whether to highlight and designate a site as a Ramsar site, but it is a locally driven initiative. So if you are a champion of a particular wetland in your community and you think it meets the criteria for this designation, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. And there's a lot of benefits that flow from that designation, including highlighting the importance of the ecosystem services that particular wetland and wetlands in general provide.
Yeah, thank you very much. That did remind me there are these international efforts by Snow Change and other groups on restoring peatlands and wetlands. So it's really important work. So with that, I would like to thank the panelists and the audience and remind the audience that the presentations and other resources, the presentations will be available on ESAL's YouTube, and other resources will be available to the participants after the event. And I apologize, we weren't able to get to all of the questions. There were a few more left. And so I encourage audience members to contact Royal and Erica directly